Today's lesson is How Canned Food Changed the World. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to continue talking about the history of canned food. Yes, indeed, if you go to your local supermarket, you can find lots of food items in cans. It's pretty convenient, especially if you're preparing for the end of the world, when there are going to be major food shortages and cosmic radiation, and another pandemic will fall upon us again. So one way to prepare for that is to have lots of food stored in cans.
That's a good idea. I'm going to have to buy a can opener before the end of the world, too.
It would be very useful, yeah.
Yeah, it would be really embarrassing to have all that canned food and no way to open it. But we've already learned that canned food actually came out of a great war. Napoleon's wars across Europe caused him to think, I need a better way to feed my army. I want to be able to carry food around and have it be safe and tasty. So someone invented canning back then. And then another Frenchman, the first one who invented it for Napoleon was a Frenchman. And then another Frenchman came along. He improved on it. And finally, a German man named Max Ams. He introduced double seams to provide airtight tin cans, pretty much like the ones we would know today. I mean, they would look a little bit different, maybe feel a little bit different when we picked them up, but basically they worked in the same way. So let's find out about what happened with canned food later on as we continue on with our article, and also how cans became the subject of one of the most famous paintings in history.
Canned food made its first major impacts in the fields of war and exploration. By providing long-lasting food that could be easily transported, canning helped enable wars such as the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. Meanwhile, explorers making expeditions to places like the North Pole relied heavily on canned food for survival. Canned food also made life much easier for civilians, especially in the years before refrigeration was widespread, as it freed people from the need to shop for fresh food every day.
大家好，第一部分我们先来介绍名词 impact， 它的意思是影响或是作用。例如 Technology has a great impact on everyone, whether you choose to use it or ignore it. 科技对每个人都有重大影响，无论你选择使用它或忽略它。又或者说 Human activity has had a negative impact on the rainforest. 人类活动对雨林有负面的冲击。再来我们看到单字 exploration， 它是名词，意思是探索、探勘或是探究。例如 European exploration of the Americas began in 1492. 欧洲人的美洲拓荒之旅自1492年展开。或是 Samantha has always been fascinated by space exploration. Samantha 一直对太空探索着迷。另外介绍它的动词 explore, E-X-P-L-O-R-E, explore, 意思是探索或是探究。例如 Ted loves to explore countries he's never been to. Ted 喜欢探索他从没去过的国家。又或者说 This article explores the relationship between sleep and diet. 这篇文章探讨睡眠与饮食之间的关联。接着我们看到名词 expedition， 指的是探险、远征或是远征队。例如 3 members of the expedition died within the first week. 探险队的3名成员在第1周内死亡。再举一个例子 The scientists went on an expedition to study penguins in Antarctica. 科学家们前往南极研究企鹅。下一个单字我们看到 civilian， 它是名词，意思是平民或是老百姓。例如 Terry received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest award for a civilian. Terry 获得了总统自由勋章，这是美国平民的最高荣誉奖章。再看一个例子 Civilian planes are not allowed to fly over this part of the country. 民间飞机不准飞越国家的这个地区。再来我们看到单字 refrigeration， 它是名词，意思是冷藏或是冷冻。我们来看个例子 Refrigeration has many applications. For instance, commercial freezers. 冷藏系统有很多应用，例如商业用冷冻库。另外 refrigeration 的动词是 refrigerate, R-E-F-R-I-G-E-R-A-T-E, refrigerate, 意思是冷藏。例如 If you refrigerate that food, it will stay fresh longer. 如果你把那个食物冷藏，它可以保鲜久一点。或是 Andy refrigerated the leftover turkey. Andy 把剩下的火鸡冷藏起来。最后我们看到的是形容词 widespread， 指的是广泛的或是普遍的。举例来说 There are widespread food shortages due to the war. 由于战争关系，食物短缺状况很普遍。再举一个例子 There was widespread damage because of the floods. 洪水造成了广泛的伤害。
Okay, let's talk about the first part of our lesson right now. Canned food made its first major impacts in the fields of war and exploration. So, of course, we got this great invention of canned food thanks to the French and a German guy. And, of course, it had its first major impacts when we talk about war and exploration. So here the word impact just means a great effect on something. It could also refer to when something hits something else quite violently or quite suddenly, like when the meteorite impacted the Earth. There was a great firestorm. I guess I'm talking about the one that happened in Russia a long time ago, the meteorite impact. But in this particular case, we're talking about the great influence of canned food, and they were in the fields or areas of war and in the areas of exploration. If you're going off to war, yes, indeed, you need to carry food with you. And if you're going to explore the South Pole or the North Pole, you also need to bring lots of canned food with you.
That's a very, very good point. And I guess also back then, people traveled by sailing ships, so those journeys would have been very long. So I guess canned food could have been really useful when you're traveling for weeks, you know, between Europe and North America, for example. So yes, during war, during travel, and also when exploring. It said, meanwhile, explorers making expeditions to places like the North Pole relied heavily on canned food for survival. Again, this canned food can last a long time. You don't have to find fresh food. You don't even actually have to cook it. It'd be nice to heat it up, but you can really just open the can and eat the food straight out of it. So for these long expeditions to the North Pole or exploring Africa or, you know, the Amazon or something like that, a long journey, often a journey of exploration and discovery when people are traveling, probably on foot or in using fairly basic methods through a very wild area where there aren't roads, where there aren't normal transportation options. You would call this an expedition. You could say, oh, we're going on a shopping expedition today. We're going to hit all the malls and all the big sales. You could use it that way, but often we think of it more of National Geographic, the first people to climb a mountain or something. They are mounting or making an expedition to some wild location like the North Pole. So they would rely on this canned food for survival. But it wasn't just explorers and soldiers who enjoyed the benefits of canned food, was it?
No, it wasn't. And again, we've got canning helping American Civil War soldiers, and we've got people fighting the Franco-Prussian War, so that, of course, helped them. And we've got explorers making expeditions to places like the North Pole, and they needed those items for survival, and canned food also made life much easier for civilians, which are people, normal people, when compared to people who are in the military. So if you're regular people, you wouldn't call yourself a civilian unless you were comparing yourself to a soldier. So if you're in the army for a while and you've been stationed at an army base or something, then you return to civilian life. You become a regular person. It may be kind of difficult to adjust to that life. But yes, indeed, for us regular folks, canned food made life much easier.
Especially in the years before refrigeration was widespread, as it freed people from the need to shop for fresh food every day. That's another thing that we take for granted. Oh, those wonderful refrigerators that we have in our homes. Those have only been there since after World War II. For most people in the world before that, you might have had an ice box that you would need large blocks of ice to keep cool. And of course, that wouldn't work as well in the summer as it would in the winter. But yeah, refrigeration, keeping food cold using some kind of method. Ice would be the most basic and oldest method of refrigeration, but now, of course, we use, Freon, we use chemicals, we use electricity to cool down certain chemicals, and that allows us to have these wonderful things, fridges or refrigerators that provide refrigeration, keeping food cold and allowing it to be fresh. This only became widespread quite recently, so before that, canned food was a wonderful thing. People could buy these cans, they could open them when they need them, and it also, as they point out, it freed people from the need. So it stopped people from having to do something. If you are freed from something, you don't have to do that anymore. When you move out of your home, you're freed from your parents' supervision or something like that. So it allowed them to not have to shop for fresh food every day because they had canned food. Back in the old days when markets were on every street corner, it might have been convenient, but as cities got bigger and as people got busier, the ability to shop for fresh food every day became more of an inconvenience. And so canned food kind of stepped into the gap, and that was a wonderful time saver.
Indeed. So, yeah, if you have canned food at home, you don't have to be cooking every day, or at least you don't have to be shopping for fresh vegetables in your local market. Who's got time to do that anyway, with people working long hours? And so they head home and they open up a can of tuna and they have some bread that they bought at the local bakery and they can have themselves a tuna sandwich there. And the tuna can probably have been in that can for several weeks and it's still good. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson. Let's listen to the next part and talk about canning's influence on art.
The most surprising influence canned food had, however, was on the art world. In 1961, a little-known American painter named Andy Warhol began to create a series of 32 paintings featuring different types of canned soup. Known as the Campbell's soup cans, these images helped him become one of the most famous artists in history. Even today, the images are considered to be among the most recognized pieces of art in the world.
Okay, so we mentioned this at the beginning of the lesson. We were talking about how canning has made things convenient for people when they need to have things to eat. But now we're talking about canning as an art form. And we've got one example here. Of course, as you know, the work of Andy Warhol focused on pop art, which we'll talk about here in some more detail. But here in the second part, it says, the most surprising influence canned food had, however, was on the art world. Now, going back to 1961, in 1961, a little-known American painter named Andy Warhol began to create a series of 32 paintings featuring different types of canned soup. You've probably seen these works of art. They're all paintings of labels of Campbell's soup, or Campbell's soup, I should say, which is a popular brand of soups, canned soups in the USA. I assume you have them in Canada as well.
Yep, they're popular all around the world. And Andy Warhol painted a series of 32 paintings, and they all featured canned soup. Campbell's canned soup. It says known as the Campbell's soup cans. These images helped him become one of the most famous artists in history. Absolutely. I think the tomato soup one is probably the most famous of them, but there are ones of different flavors of the Campbell's soup. There's ones with many cans, smaller images of cans in one image in one big picture. But yeah, it was an interesting thing where someone took something very everyday, very normal, something you find on supermarket shelves all across the country, and made it the subject of a painting, made it a piece of art or something like that, partly because canned foods and canned soups were so common. Andy Warhol thought it would be interesting to take something common and give it a very uncommon artistic treatment. Even today, the images, these images of Andy Warhol's soup cans, the images are considered to be among the most recognized pieces of art in the world. Yeah, probably if you wanted to ask your average person to name an Andy Warhol painting, they might pick out the famous one of Marilyn Monroe or Elvis or something like that. But I think his Campbell's soup cans are still his most recognized piece of art.
Indeed, and it's kind of interesting because they're just paintings of soup cans with no special technique applied. I guess there is a special technique in the way he used colors and stuff like that, but I think a lot of people will look at those and think, that's art? That's ridiculous. But it is unique and it is quite common in the world. Everybody knows about the Campbell's soup cans. And, of course, it helped him become one of the most famous artists in history. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now and talk about the third part, which wraps things up.
From its humble beginnings as a French candy maker's invention, canning grew to play a huge role in transforming our world. So, when you pick up a can of beans, bear in mind that you're also holding an amazing invention that has truly changed the world.
Okay, so again, when you finish an article, you can use this pattern from something to something else. So we're talking about from its humble beginnings as a French candy maker's invention, canning grew to play a huge role in transforming our world. Okay, we don't have the to there, but this is a similar concept. We're talking about when it started, it was just this, and later on, it resulted in this. So we've got these humble beginnings, which means it was a simple need. Napoleon needed to conquer different countries of Europe, and of course, that's the humble beginning. And, of course, it began as an invention from a French candy maker who entered this contest, this competition. I guess he won the initial one, but then, of course, improvements were made along the way.
That's right, but it was only supposed to just be food for soldiers when they're on the march in the middle of a war. But now, of course, we can find canned goods on the store shelves all over the world. So when you pick up a can of beans or a can of soup or a can of vegetables or a can of almost anything else, so when you pick up a can of beans, bear in mind that you're also holding an amazing invention that has truly changed the world. Yeah, I mean, if you think that canned goods helped us explore to the furthest corners of the world or fight wars all over the world that changed human history, it's quite amazing that the simple canned vegetable or canned food allowed many of those amazing accomplishments and achievements to actually happen. So there you go. It might just be a can of peas, but it's not just a can of peas.
Indeed. So, of course, there are lots of different kinds of food items you can buy in cans. You can buy a can of beans. That helps.
Canned bread.
Canned bread. I haven't heard of that one.
No, I've heard of it. I've never tried it, though. I've always been curious about that one.
Have you ever opened a can of bread before?
No, I've never even seen. Of course, if I found one, I would open it and eat it. But no, I've just heard about it.
Kind of interesting.
Sounds like a bad idea to me, but then again, if I was in the North Pole and I wanted bread, that might be the best way to get it.
If you want your bread, but I don't know exactly where you get your butter from.
True. Canned butter.
Yeah, that's possible. I think there is canned butter here in Taiwan.
Really?
There's some kind of brand that has a yellow can or something. It's canned butter that is quite common. But in any case, yes, there are lots of examples of food that you can get in cans. But you need to remember or bear in mind that you are holding an important, amazing invention, and it has indeed changed the world. And that's where canning came about. And there's our history of canning for today's lesson. So let's wrap things up now by listening to Hanny, and then we'll come back with our discussion starter.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分有一句提到，前往北极等地探险的探险家极度仰赖罐头食品来生存。那文中用到单字 expedition 去表达探险，我们来学习它的字首字根。好，看到 PED 或是拼作 PEDI， 或者是 POD 或是 PUS 这一类字根呢，表示 foot， 也就是足部。那很多生物的名字都带有这几个字根哦，像 centipede CENTI 这个部分它是指 100 100。那 centipede， 所以从字面看好像是在讲100只脚，同学们猜得到是什么吗？那就是蜈蚣，它是不是又称为百足虫呢？它们就好像有100只脚一样。好，那么在 expedition 这个字当中啊，它的字首 ex 表示向外， pedi 表示足部，那么 tion 是名词字尾，我们就可以用往外走去联想到 expedition， 它有远征探险的意思。顺便补充2个有这一类字根的单字，第一个是 impede， I-M-P-E-D-E， 它的字首 I-M 是来自 I-N， 那么 I-N 因为碰到 B-M 或是 P 才拼作 I-M， 那这个字首它表示往内，那么 P-E-D-E 是足部，如果有东西摆在两脚之间，那是不是会妨碍到我们前进呢？用这样的方式也许可以联想到 impede， 它有妨碍、阻碍的意思。好，第二个补充的是 tripod， 它的字首 T-R-I 表示3，1、2、3的那个3，那么 P-O-D pod 表示足，那3只脚指的是什么呢？其实 tripod 就是三脚架的意思哦。好，那么课文第3部分的第一句写到，从法国糖果师傅的发明这个不起眼的开始，罐头制造在改变世界方面逐渐发挥巨大的作用。那文中是用 play a huge role in 来表达在什么方面发挥了巨大的作用。好，那当我们用 play a part 或者是 play a role 加 in 再加上戏剧作品，其实是可以用来表达在戏剧作品当中来饰演一角。那么 part 或是 role 的前面还可以加入形容词，举例来说， Brad played a small part in the film。 Brad 在那部电影里面饰演一个小角色。好，那接着呢，我们也可以像课文的用法，你就是用 play 加上 a 或 an 加一个形容词，再加上 part 或是 role in 再加名词或动名词，去表达说对什么有影响，在什么方面起作用，扮演了什么样的角色。那这时候 part 或是 role 前方所常用的形容词呢，除了课文用到的 huge， 还可以用 important 重要的， major 主要的， key 关键的， crucial 决定性的，非常重要的等等。例如 Elaine played a vital role in saving the company from bankruptcy。 Elaine 在拯救公司免于破产方面呢，扮演了至关重要的角色。好，那么以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天单字吧。
Impact. Poverty can have major impacts on a child's educational opportunities. Exploration. The scientists began an exploration of the newly discovered cave system. Expedition. Mr. Pearson plans to go on an expedition to climb Mount Everest. Civilian. In addition to military deaths, the war has killed a large number of civilians. Refrigeration. The fishermen use refrigeration to keep their fish fresh before they're sold. Widespread. The reports of a dangerous chemical leak caused widespread panic in the city.
Discussion starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. The question is, do you think the course of history would have changed significantly if Nicolas Appert hadn't invented canning? Why or why not?
That's an excellent question. I wonder if a historian's ever look into it. Like, could Napoleon have conquered all the parts of Europe he eventually did if they didn't have canned food? You know, did the invention of canning allow Napoleon to dominate Europe? That's a wonderful question. And of course, I think it really would have changed things in a lot of ways. We probably wouldn't have big stores and supermarkets like we do now. A lot of those came along because there were so many of these good preserved canned goods to sell to people. We might still all be shopping in local farmers markets or something like that. So I think that's one definite difference that we would notice right around us if suddenly we lost the science of canning.
Well, I do think the course of history would have changed a lot, since it allowed soldiers and armies to carry food that they were used to when they invaded other countries. So, of course, if we talk about the French invading Russia, well, they would have been more happy to fight for their country if they could bring along some of their most popular dishes like filet mignon or whatever it is the French like to eat. If they could bring that stuff along with them and eat it on the battlefield, hey, they'd be more willing to fight for the mother country. If they went to Russia and they had to rely on local food, like what do they have there? Borscht and other things like that. Potatoes and to drink vodka and things like turnips, yeah. That may not be appetizing to the average Frenchman. So being able to carry canned goods on your escapades through various countries was definitely a plus, and it definitely changed the world.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.